Another rotation, another batch of soft-skinned disappointments. I flexed all 4 of my arms simultaneously, each one capable of crushing a standard-issue helmet like an overripe fruit. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Galactic Defense Academy's training grounds, and frankly, it was the most impressive thing I'd seen all week. My name is Instructor Moran, and at 7 feet of pure Krellian muscle and bone plating, I am what lesser species call intimidating. Today's assignment: breaking in the newest batch of recruits. Easy money if you asked me. The training yard buzzed with nervous energy as various species clustered together like frightened livestock. 3 massive Gorvakians stood in formation, their rocky exteriors gleaming in the sunlight. Smart move, sticking together. A pack of 6-limbed Zenthari cadets practiced synchronized movements, their natural coordination already putting them ahead of the competition. Even the crystalline-scaled Vorthak twins seemed more promising than usual. And then there were the humans, 3 of them, just 3. Standing apart from the others with an almost casual indifference that I found amusing. The tall female with short brown hair kept scanning the facility, like she was memorizing every bolt and rivet. Her name tag read A. Kowalski. Next to her, a stocky male with an easy grin chatted quietly with his companion, B. Torres, according to his uniform. The third, an older human with graying temples and sharp eyes, simply stood at attention. Commander T. Mali. I had to suppress a laugh. Commander? These pink hairless bipeds barely qualified as mammals, let alone military material. Their bones looked like they'd snap if someone looked at them too hard. No natural armor, no enhanced senses, no extra limbs for combat advantage. Evolution had clearly forgotten about them halfway through the process. This was going to be the easiest rotation of my career. I strode to the center of the training ground, my heavy footsteps echoing off the metal flooring like thunder. Time to establish the pecking order. With deliberate precision, I picked up a solid titanium training bar, standard equipment that typically required 2 cadets to lift safely. Listen up, meatbags. My voice boomed across the yard as I bent the metal bar into a perfect pretzel with 2 hands while my other 2 arms remained casually crossed behind my back. I am Instructor Moran, and for the next 6 months I own your miserable lives. The titanium groaned and snapped like a twig. Several cadets flinched. Good. You see these? I flexed all 4 arms in sequence, each bicep the size of a small shuttle engine. 4 arms means 4 times the combat capability of your average bipedal disappointment. This, I tapped my chest plate with 1 knuckle, producing a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. Natural bone armor. Krellian evolution perfected what your species could only dream of achieving. Quartermaster A, a nervous Zenthari, with twitching antennae, actually took a step backward. Judge Quintara, one of the more experienced Gorvakian cadets, nodded with what I interpreted as appropriate respect. The crystalline Vorthak twins exchanged glances that screamed, "We're in trouble." Perfect. Fear was the beginning of wisdom. Now let's address the obvious question. I turned toward the humans with theatrical slowness. What cosmic joke resulted in your species being here? No natural weapons, no armor plating, no enhanced reflexes. You can't even survive in your own planet's atmosphere without artificial assistance half the time. Amy Kowalski's expression remained completely neutral. Brandon Torres continued that infuriating grin of his. Commander Mali simply stood at attention, taking mental notes like he was attending a lecture on agricultural techniques. Their complete lack of reaction was unexpected. Most species either cowered appropriately or puffed up with false bravado at this point. These 3 humans just stood there like they were waiting for me to finish talking so they could get on with their day. Your species is what happens when evolution gets distracted, I continued, circling them slowly. Soft skin that tears at the slightest provocation, brittle bones that snap under pressure, single hearts that stop functioning if you look at them wrong. You're basically walking medical emergencies wrapped in tissue paper. Still nothing. Not even a twitch. Their composure was almost professional, which was ridiculous, because there was nothing professional about being a biological failure. I'd broken stronger species than these pink weaklings with my opening speech alone. This was going to be easier than I thought. 3 hours later, I had the holographic training chamber configured for what I like to call creative disappointment. The simulation featured a multi-level urban combat scenario with enemies positioned at heights requiring significant jumping ability, obstacles demanding 4-limb coordination, and targets that moved too fast for single-eye tracking systems. In other words, it was designed specifically to showcase exactly why humans didn't belong here. First exercise, maggots, I announced, gesturing toward the shimmering blue environment with 3 of my arms while the 4th operated the control panel. Urban pacification scenario. Multiple hostiles, varying elevations, time limit of 8 minutes, Gorvakians, you're up first. Judge Quintara and his rocky companions lumbered through the simulation with predictable competence. Their stone-like skin deflected simulated energy blasts, while their natural strength let them smash through barriers. Time, 6 minutes, 43 seconds. Adequate. The Zenthari team followed, using their 6 limbs to navigate the vertical elements with spider-like grace. Their compound eyes tracked multiple targets simultaneously, while their natural speed kept them ahead of the enemy fire patterns. Time, 5 minutes, 58 seconds. Impressive even by my standards. Vorthak twins, your turn. The crystalline duo moved like liquid mercury, their scales refracting the holographic light beams to create false targets while they flanked the enemy positions. Time, 6 minutes, 12 seconds. Not bad for ice sculptures with delusions of grandeur. Then came the main event. Humans. Try not to die immediately. It would reflect poorly on my teaching methods. Amy Kowalski entered the simulation first. Within 30 seconds, she was pinned down behind inadequate cover, unable to reach the elevated positions without assistance. Her single set of eyes couldn't track the multiple target vectors, and her soft human flesh registered damage from the first simulated energy burst. Final time, simulation terminated at 2 minutes, 14 seconds, due to catastrophic mission failure. I couldn't suppress my chuckle. Perhaps try running faster next time. Cadet Kowalski. She gave me the strangest look, almost like she was trying not to laugh. Odd reaction for someone who'd just been publicly humiliated. Brandon Torres stepped up next, and if anything, performed even worse. He seemed to spend most of his time studying the enemy movement patterns instead of actually engaging them. When he did move, he used cover inefficiently and took angles that any first-year tactical student would recognize as suboptimal. Time, 1 minute, 57 seconds before total mission failure. Fascinating approach, Torres. Were you perhaps attempting to demonstrate how not to conduct urban warfare? Just trying to understand the parameters, sir, he replied with that same infuriating grin. Quick question. Are there any restrictions on how we engage the targets, like specific weapon limitations or environmental factors we need to consider? I blinked at him with all 4 eyes. The failure was asking about strategy. How adorable. Commander Molly's attempt was perhaps the most amusing yet. He moved through the simulation like he was conducting a scientific experiment, methodically testing different approaches and seemingly taking mental notes on enemy response patterns. Time, mission failure at 3 minutes, 8 seconds. Commander Molly, I said, noting how he was still scribbling something on his datapad even after failing spectacularly. Might I suggest focusing on survival rather than documentation? Just gathering data, sir, he replied calmly. Very instructive exercise design. The man was taking notes on his own failure. I'd never seen anything quite so pathetically optimistic. By the second week, I'd really hit my stride. The obstacle course I designed was a masterpiece of species-specific torture. Monkey bars spaced for forearm reach. Balance beams, requiring 6-limb coordination. Wall climbs with handholds positioned for beings with natural climbing claws. Every element perfectly calibrated to showcase exactly why soft 2-limbed mammals had no business in military service. The morning started beautifully. Judge Quintara's massive frame powered through the course like a living boulder, using his natural Gorvakian strength to simply punch through obstacles that were meant to be navigated around. Time, 4 minutes, 12 seconds. The Zenthari team flowed across the equipment like it had been designed specifically for them, which, let's be honest, it basically had been. Time, 3 minutes, 41 seconds. Then came my entertainment for the day. Amy Kowalski approached the first obstacle, a rope climb with handholds spaced for beings with 4-foot arm spans. She stared at it for a long moment, then began this awkward, inefficient process of swinging between holds like some kind of primitive primate. It was painful to watch. Kowalski, I bellowed across the training yard. This is a military exercise, not interpretive dance. Either climb the rope, or admit your species lacks the basic motor functions required for combat operations. That's when I noticed Admiral Vashi and Admiral Drawhorn approaching the observation deck. Perfect timing. Nothing like having superior officers witness my legendary training methods in action. Gentlemen, I called out, gesturing toward the struggling human with 2 of my arms, while keeping the other 2 crossed in a display of casual dominance. Observe the natural limitations of bipedal physiology. Amy had now somehow managed to reach the top of the rope, but her technique was so unorthodox it barely qualified as climbing. She'd used her legs to create leverage points, wrapped the rope around her body for support, and basically turned the entire exercise into some kind of full-body puzzle-solving experience. Fascinating, Admiral Vashi murmured, his scaled head tilting as he watched. Most creative. I preened at the compliment. Thank you, sir. I find that highlighting species inadequacies through practical demonstration is far more effective than simple lecture. Brandon Torres was now attempting the balance beam section, which required traversing a series of narrow metal bars while carrying a 50-pound equipment pack. The bars were positioned for 6 lem weight distribution. Torres, with his laughably inadequate 2 arms and 2 legs, should have fallen off immediately. Instead, he was doing something that looked suspiciously like gymnastics. He'd somehow figured out how to use momentum and body positioning to maintain balance, turning the entire exercise into this fluid rolling motion that technically got him across each beam. It wasn't how the course was supposed to be completed, but... Torres, I snapped. This is military training, not a circus performance. Use proper form or fail like the biological accident you are. Sorry, sir, he called back cheerfully, continuing his improvised acrobatic routine. Just working with what I've got. The worst part was that Commander Molly was helping them. Actually helping. When Amy struggled with the wall climb, Molly positioned himself below to provide a boost step. When Torres needed better grip on the overhead traverse, Molly used his own body as a stabilizing platform. They were functioning as some kind of primitive pack unit, compensating for individual weaknesses through group coordination. It was pathetic. And somehow, it was working. Sir, Admiral Drawhorn commented quietly. Their adaptation rate is quite remarkable. Adaptation. I laughed, a sound like grinding metal. Admiral, with respect, what you're witnessing is creative cheating. They're improvising because they lack the basic physical capabilities to complete the course as designed. It's desperation, not tactical thinking. But even as I said it, watching Commander Molly boost Amy up to a handhold she couldn't reach alone, I felt the tiniest flicker of something. Unease, maybe. No, ridiculous. They were still failing, just failing with more style than usual. 3 weeks in, and these humans were starting to get on my nerves. Not because they were succeeding. Oh no, they were still failing magnificently at every conventional metric I threw at them. The problem was that they kept showing up, every morning, bright and early, with that same infuriating determination to get demolished again. Normal species had the decency to quit after the first week of public humiliation. The Zenthari cadets who'd washed out last rotation had at least possessed enough self-awareness to recognize when they were outclassed. These humans, they just kept coming back for more punishment like some kind of masochistic science experiment. It was time for a more direct approach. Hand-to-hand combat demonstration, I announced during the morning briefing, flexing my 4 arms in sequence. Today we'll be covering close quarters engagement techniques for asymmetric encounters. I let my gaze settle on the human trio, who were listening with that same focused attention they brought to everything. I need a volunteer to serve as my demonstration partner. The other cadets suddenly found their boots fascinating. Smart creatures, Torres. I pointed directly at the stocky human, with my primary right arm, while my secondary left drummed an intimidating rhythm on my thigh. Front and center. Brandon Torres actually grinned as he stepped forward. The absolute audacity of this creature never ceased to amaze me. Here I was, offering him the chance to be personally educated by 7 feet of apex predator, and he looked like someone had just offered him dessert. I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. General Krafnog, the Academy's head of combat instruction, had entered the training area. Behind him, Instructor Moran, a fellow Krellian, and one of the few beings I actually respected, settled against the far wall to observe. Perfect. Nothing like having professional witnesses to my inevitable dominance display. The key to understanding interspecies combat, I began, circling Torres like a predator sizing up prey, is recognizing the fundamental biological advantages that separate apex species from evolutionary footnotes. Torres nodded politely, still wearing that maddening smile. Makes sense, sir. Quick question though, are we talking about a specific combat scenario, or more general principles? Another question. This human asked more questions than a Zenthari youngling during molting season. General principles, Torres, such as the obvious advantages of multiple limbs in grappling scenarios. I demonstrated by extending all 4 arms in a combat stance, that would allow me to control multiple contact points simultaneously. Or the benefits of natural armor plating, when absorbing impact damage. From the corner of my eye, I caught Amy Kowalski giving Torres a look. Something sharp and warning, like she was trying to communicate without words. Torres glanced back at her with what looked almost like reassurance. How touching. The pack animals were concerned for each other. Now then, I announced, settling into a ready position that showcased every intimidating inch of my frame. Let me demonstrate the fundamental futility of challenging a superior opponent. General Krafnog leaned forward slightly, his own 4 arms crossed in professional interest. Morden's expression was unreadable behind his bone face mask, but I could sense his anticipation. This was going to be educational for everyone involved. I decided it was time to deliver the lesson these mammals would never forget. Standing at my full 7-foot height, all 4 arms spread wide in a display of absolute dominance, I prepared to educate Brandon Torres and everyone watching about the natural order of the galaxy. Before we begin this demonstration, I announced, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet training facility, I want everyone to observe the fundamental differences between evolved apex predators and evolutionary mistakes. Torres stood relaxed in front of me, hands at his sides, that infernal smile still plastered across his soft human features. Perfect. His casual posture would make the contrast even more dramatic. Humans, I continued, warming up to what I considered my finest speech yet, represent perhaps the most glaring example of biological failure in the known galaxy. Weak bones that snap under minimal pressure, fragile skin that tears at the slightest contact, single hearts that stop functioning if you breathe on them too hard. A few chuckles from the assembled cadets, even General Krafnog seemed amused. Your species evolved on a backwater planet, with such minimal selective pressure that you never developed any meaningful survival adaptations. No natural weapons, no armor, no enhanced reflexes. I stepped closer to Torres, using my height advantage to cast him in shadow. You're basically mobile medical emergencies, wrapped in tissue paper. Torres nodded thoughtfully, like he was actually considering the validity of my assessment. The absolute nerve of this creature. In fact, I said, raising my voice for the grand finale, your species is so pathetically fragile, you couldn't hurt a. The world exploded into stars and pain. I found myself on the ground, jaw hanging at an angle that definitely wasn't anatomically correct, staring up at the training facility's ceiling through a haze of shock and disbelief. My natural bone armor, the pride of Krellian evolution, had apparently done absolutely nothing to prevent whatever had just happened to my face. The entire facility had gone dead silent. Not the kind of silence that follows a good demonstration, the kind that follows a natural disaster. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Brandon Torres' voice, still carrying that same casual conversational tone he'd maintained throughout 3 weeks of systematic humiliation. Sorry sir, did I interrupt something? He was standing exactly where he'd been before, hands back at his sides, looking down at me with what appeared to be genuine concern, like he hadn't. What in the name of all the void-spawned hells had just happened? Someone might want to call the medical team, Torres added helpfully. I think his jaw's broken. My brain was having serious difficulty processing recent events. One moment, I'd been delivering what was destined to become a legendary speech about human inferiority. The next moment, I was horizontal, tasting metal, and questioning everything I thought I knew about physics. The medical droids arrived with their usual efficiency, their scanners humming as they assessed the damage. Instructor Moran, the lead unit, announced in its clinically cheerful voice, "You have sustained a compound fracture of the mandible, displacement of the temporomandibular joint, and significant bruising to the cranial bone plating. Estimated recovery time, 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. From one punch, from a human. Fascinating," Admiral Vashi commented, and I turned my head just enough to see him approaching with what could only be described as a knowing smirk. Absolutely fascinating, sir, I tried to say, but the broken jaw made it sound more like sure, which was not particularly dignified for a Krellian instructor in front of his superiors. Brandon Torres crouched down beside me, still wearing that same helpful expression. Sorry about that, sir. I probably should have mentioned that human bone density is actually higher than most people realize, and our muscle fiber composition is optimized for explosive power rather than sustained strength. What? See, that's the thing about deceptive evolution, Torres continued conversationally while the medical droids worked on stabilizing my jaw. We look weak, because we don't have big obvious muscles or armor plating, but our entire musculoskeletal system is built for efficiency, high power-to-weight ratio, excellent leverage mechanics, really precise motor control. Amy Kowalski had approached and was nodding along like Torres was delivering a fascinating lecture. Plus there's the psychological advantage, she added. Most species see us as non-threatening, which means they don't bother with proper defensive positioning. Like standing within striking range while delivering insulting speeches. My primary eyes focused on her with growing horror. Had she just analyzed my tactical failure while I was lying here with a broken face? Speaking of which, Commander Molly said, pulling out that ever-present datapad, I've been documenting some interesting patterns in your instruction methods, Moran. He scrolled through what appeared to be extensive notes. Consistent overconfidence, predictable positioning during confrontational scenarios, tendency to telegraph aggressive intent, and a remarkable blind spot regarding opponent assessment. He'd been taking notes, not just casual observations, detailed tactical analysis. For 3 weeks, you've been studying me, I managed to slur out through the medical restraints. Standard operating procedure, Molly replied, matter-of-factly. Know your training environment, understand your instructor's capabilities and limitations, adapt accordingly. Basic military intelligence gathering. General Krafnog stepped into my field of vision, his forearms crossed in what I was beginning to recognize as professional assessment, rather than casual interest. Remarkable, he rumbled. 3 weeks of systematic information gathering while maintaining operational cover. Textbook psychological warfare. Around the training yard, I could see the other cadets watching with expressions that ranged from shock to something that looked suspiciously like respect. Judge Quintara's rocky features actually seemed impressed. The Zenthari team was chittering among themselves in what sounded like excited analysis. Even the Vorthak twins were regarding the humans with something approaching professional interest. The really clever part, Amy was explaining to anyone who would listen, was maintaining the appearance of failure while actually studying the training systems. Every failed exercise gave us data about optimal approaches, system limitations, and instructor expectations. Wait, Admiral Drahorn said slowly. Are you saying that all those spectacular failures were intentional? Brandon Torres grinned. Well, not the failing part. We really were struggling with equipment designed for different body types, but the information gathering, that was absolutely intentional. I stared up at them through the medical scanner beams, feeling something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine respect mixed with absolute mortification. These humans had been playing me from day one. What happened next was perhaps the most educational experience of my military career, and I wasn't even conscious for half of it. Once the medical droids had stabilized my jaw and pumped me full of enough painkillers to stun a Gorvakian, Admiral Vashi made an announcement that sent chills through my remaining functional bone plating. I think, he said with that same knowing smirk, it's time for a proper demonstration of human combat capabilities. Kowalski, would you mind showing us what you can actually do? Amy stepped forward, and something about her entire posture changed. Gone was the struggling cadet who'd barely managed to complete my obstacle courses. In her place stood something that looked disturbingly like a professional soldier. Certainly, sir. Extended combat scenario, multiple opponents or endurance demonstration. Surprise me, Vashi replied. What followed was 47 minutes of the most terrifying physical display I'd ever witnessed. Amy began with what she casually called basic cardiovascular output, a sustained combat simulation that involved fighting holographic enemies while maintaining constant movement for nearly an hour. No breaks, no reduction in performance, no signs of fatigue. For comparison, most Krillian warriors needed rest periods every 12 minutes during intensive combat. Amy just kept going, and going, and going. Human cardiovascular systems, she explained while simultaneously disarming 3 simulated attackers, evolved for persistence hunting. We're built to maintain moderate output, indefinitely rather than short bursts of maximum power. Persistence hunting, they'd turned endurance into a weapon. Brandon, Admiral Drahorn, called out, your turn. If Amy's demonstration had been unsettling, Brandon's was downright nightmarish. He moved through a precision combat course, designed for beings with enhanced reflexes, hitting targets that required split-second timing and accuracy that should have been impossible for a species with single-eye tracking systems. Human visual processing, he explained, while casually putting simulated rounds through targets the size of small coins, includes exceptional pattern recognition and predictive capability. We don't just see where things are, we calculate where they're going to be. The targets were moving in random patterns. He was hitting them anyway. Plus, he added, demonstrating a combat roll that ended with him firing accurately while inverted. Our balance and spatial awareness systems are extremely sophisticated. Comes from evolving as bipedal hunters in complex three-dimensional environments. Every shot, perfect. Every movement, fluid. Every explanation, delivered with that same casual tone he'd used to ask about exercise parameters. Commander Molly stepped forward without being asked. Tactical analysis demonstration. Please, General Krafnog said. I think even he was beginning to look unsettled. Molly proceeded to break down every training exercise I designed over the past 3 weeks, explaining not just how they could be completed more efficiently, but how they could be redesigned to actually serve their intended training purposes. He'd identified 17 specific weaknesses in my course design, 12 ways to improve the holographic combat scenarios, and had developed alternative approaches for every single species in our training group. Human cognitive architecture, he explained, while projecting his analysis onto the main display screen, emphasizes pattern recognition, adaptive problem solving, and what we call lateral thinking, approaching problems from unexpected angles. The display showed detailed personality profiles for every cadet in our group, including psychological assessments that were more thorough than the official academy evaluations. He'd been watching everyone, not just me. We've also been collaborating with the other species, Amy added, sharing information, developing cooperative strategies, identifying complementary capabilities. My primary eyes darted around the training yard. Judge Quintara was nodding respectfully at Amy. The Zentharai team was chittering excitedly at Brandon, apparently asking for precision shooting tips. The Vorthak twins were studying Molly's tactical projections with obvious professional interest. They weren't just showing respect, they were asking for advice. From the humans, from the species I'd spent 3 weeks publicly humiliating as evolutionary failures. The truly impressive part, Admiral Vashi commented, is the operational security. 3 weeks of intelligence gathering, while maintaining complete cover identities as struggling recruits. That level of discipline and coordination suggests extensive prior training. Standard academy preparation, sir, Molly replied. We reviewed all available data on academy training protocols, instructor methodologies, and interspecies military integration challenges before arrival. They'd researched us. Before they'd even arrived, they'd known exactly what to expect, and had planned accordingly. I was a Krellian instructor with 15 years of experience, and I'd been completely systematically, professionally outmaneuvered by 3 primitive bipeds. My authority wasn't just undermined, it was obliterated. 2 days later, with my jaw held together by medical stabilizers, and my pride in approximately the same condition, Admiral Vashi made an announcement that completed my humiliation. For today's exercise, we'll be using a scenario designed by our human cadets. Kowalski, would you care to explain the parameters? Mommy stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd never failed a day in her life. Certainly, sir. The scenario focuses on adaptive problem solving under resource constraints. Multiple objectives, limited equipment, emphasis on efficiency and team coordination, rather than individual physical advantages. In other words, she designed something that would completely neutralize every natural advantage the rest of us possessed. The holographic environment materialized around us. An urban disaster zone, with collapsed buildings, limited visibility, and objectives scattered across a 3-dimensional maze that required careful navigation rather than brute force. Equipment was restricted to basic gear with no allowances for species-specific modifications. The instructors will participate alongside cadets, Admiral Drahorn announced, and I felt my remaining dignity crumble into dust. This will be educational for everyone involved. Educational. Right. Judge Quintara, with all his Gorvakian strength, found himself stuck at the first checkpoint, when his massive frame couldn't fit through the debris passages. The Zentharai team's 6-limb coordination meant nothing when the environment required single-file movement through confined spaces. The Vorthak twins' crystalline forms actually worked against them in the low-light conditions that formed the core of the scenario. And me? I was a 7-foot-tall, 4-armed disaster waiting to happen. Every passage was too narrow, every handhold positioned for 2 armed beings, every objective requiring the kind of precise, delicate manipulation that my natural strength made nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the humans flowed through the environment like they'd designed it, which technically, they had. The key, Amy explained while effortlessly navigating a section that had taken me 15 minutes to barely squeeze through, is understanding that most environments favor adaptability over raw capability. Flexibility beats force. Brandon appeared beside me as I struggled with a coordination puzzle that required 4 separate actions to be performed simultaneously. "Here, let me show you a technique," he said, proceeding to solve in 30 seconds what I'd been failing at for 5 minutes. It's all about rhythm and timing rather than trying to power through. The absolute casualness of his instruction was somehow more devastating than his earlier demonstration of violence. By the end of the exercise, the final rankings spoke for themselves. Humans first, second, and third place. Everyone else, including 3 instructors with decades of experience, scattered throughout the bottom half of the list. "Moran," Amy said as we gathered for debrief, her tone professional but somehow final, "your teaching methodology focuses heavily on exploiting species' weaknesses rather than developing individual strengths. That approach tends to create adversarial learning environments that inhibit actual skill development." It was the most polite professional assassination I'd ever witnessed. "If you'd like," Brandon added helpfully, "we could set up some additional training sessions. Help you work on adaptive instruction techniques, maybe some cross-species pedagogical approaches." He was offering to teach me how to teach. The human was offering to train the trainer. "I think," Commander Molly said quietly, consulting his datapad, "Instructor Moran might benefit from reassignment to a position that better utilizes his natural capabilities. Perhaps something in logistics or equipment maintenance." Equipment maintenance. They were suggesting I'd be better suited to fixing broken machinery than training soldiers. The worst part was that they were probably right. 3 weeks later, sitting in the Academy Medical Center with my jaw finally healed and my transfer orders in hand, I found myself doing something I'd never done before, genuinely analyzing my own failure. The humans hadn't just beaten me, they'd played me like a musical instrument, and I'd danced to every note they'd composed. From the very first day, everything I'd interpreted as weakness had been carefully calculated misdirection. Their struggles with the obstacle courses, information gathering on equipment limitations and instructor expectations, their innocent questions about parameters and rules, intelligence collection on system vulnerabilities, their casual note-taking during failures, tactical analysis of the entire training environment. They'd turned apparent incompetence into operational cover, and I'd been too arrogant to see it. The truly humbling part was realizing that human weakness wasn't a flaw in their evolution. It was a feature. They'd developed into the galaxy's most effective psychological warfare specialists by convincing everyone else that they weren't threats. Who bothers to defend against something that appears harmless? I'd spent 15 years as a military instructor, and these 3 primitive bipeds had taught me more about strategy, tactics, and the fundamental principles of warfare than my entire previous career combined. They'd shown me that the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who looks threatening. It's the one who convinces you they're not worth worrying about right up until the moment they break your jaw. Brandon Torres had been smiling for 3 weeks straight, and I'd thought it was because he was too stupid to understand how badly he was failing. Turns out, he'd been smiling because he'd known exactly how badly I was about to fail. The humans didn't just practice psychological warfare, they'd turned it into an art form, and I'd been their canvas. Final scene. Role reversal complete. 150 words. 6 months later, I stood at the medical bay observation window, watching the training grounds where my career had died. The view was illuminating. Amy Kowalski wore assistant instructor insignia on her uniform, leading a mixed-species advanced tactics seminar. Her students, including several Krellian cadets who would have laughed at the idea 6 months ago, hung on every word. On the combat range, Brandon Torres commanded a joint species strike team, coordinating Zenthari speed with Gorvakian strength and Vorthak precision into something that looked suspiciously like military poetry. His easy grin remained unchanged, but now everyone understood what it really meant. Commander Molly sat in the strategy center, consulting with Admiral Vashi and 3 other senior instructors on something called human integration protocols. His datapad naturally was covered with notes. As I turned to leave for my new assignment in equipment logistics, one final thought struck me with crystal clarity. Never underestimate the species that named their planet dirt and still conquered it. The humans had been trying to tell us who they were all along. We just hadn't been smart enough to listen.